So yeah, I understand this topic is quite technical, but rest assured that our speakers will help you walk away with so much clarity and learning. There won't be any exam, as I mentioned. And I want to warmly welcome our two speakers. So today we have Sejal Patel, who is an environmental economist and senior researcher at the International Institute for Environment and Development. She has 10 years of experience. Her work focuses on climate and environment finance, public policy and governance, particularly in relation to low carbon, climate resilient development, and on the themes of supporting inclusive and equitable processes that bridge local priorities and voices with the national and international levels. Sejal holds a Bachelor in Economics and Geography from UCL and a Master's in Environmental Economics and Climate Change from LSE. Welcome, Sejal. And we also have Alexandre Portnoi, who has over a decade of experience in legal advisory for finance and corporate transactions. He serves as a senior legal advisor at Conservation International, focusing on carbon finance and other impact and nature-based investments. He recently led the legal team for Conservation International in the Indonesia debt for nature swap transaction. Alexandre is admitted to practice law in both New York and Brazil and holds an LLM in corporate law from New York University School of Law. Without further ado, Sejal, take it away. I have to unmute you though.
Yeah, here we go. Thanks, Amal. And hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I'm going to give a bit of a 101 guide on debt for climate and nature swaps. So I'm going to start by talking about the links between debt, climate and nature and their crises, and then talk a bit more about swaps as a tool and how they can work. Looking at public debt in developing countries, public and private debt, according to the IMF and the World Bank, around 60% of low-income countries are assessed as facing a high risk of debt distress or are already in debt distress. This is a number that's doubled since 2015, and there have been a number of economic shocks in the last few years that have had a significant impact on the debt stocks, the debt stock levels of developing countries. But if you look at this graph, and you can see that although recent economic shocks, and this graph only goes up to around 2020 or so, so we don't see the very recent impacts, but you can see that although there's been this
Uh-oh, I think we lost you, Sejal.
seems to still be running from my side.
Now you're back.
I'm back. Okay, great. Okay, thanks for that. Okay, yeah, and so this graph is showing that the debt stocks have been accumulating over a long period of time. And then we can see sort of the impact of intervention. So if you note that the HIPC initiative, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, that was a comprehensive debt relief initiative, came into place around the end of the 1990s. And then you can sort of see this leveling off of debt. And then you see around 2008, when the financial crisis struck, the debt has been rising exponentially since then. And part of this is because of shocks, part of this is because of negative cycles of debt building up. Next slide, please. Yeah, so the left-hand diagram here is very small, but I've put a link, so hopefully you can navigate to the paper. There's a GCF paper that includes this, but it sets out a bit of the cyclical nature of macroeconomic issues such as debt and climate impact and the negative feedback loops they can have. So higher indebtedness can increase the vulnerability of countries to climate impact. And as countries have less resources to address and protect themselves because of the high indebtedness, the the climate impacts worsen their debt positions, so it becomes a negative cycle. And then the map here just shows the geographic distribution of debt stocks. Next slide, please. And then we also have climate change as a massive macroeconomic destabilizer of economies. So UNEP's adaptation gap report last year found a financing gap for developing countries of $387 billion a year to 2030. There's growing recognition at the international level for the need to fill this gap. At COP29 last year, at the end of last year, developed countries committed to mobilize $300 billion for climate annually by 2035, going some way to try to fill this gap. Next slide, please. And then similarly, there's a negative feedback loop between the impacts on nature and debt as well. So the destruction of nature, the unsustainable use of nature, the neglect of nature and biodiversity, or of the local communities and indigenous peoples that are living close to and are stewarding some of this biodiversity and nature. And so there's an estimated funding gap of $700 billion annually to adequately support nature and nature-based communities. And at the COP16 biodiversity talks, there was a commitment agreed to mobilize at least $200 billion per year by 2030. Next slide, please. So these are three areas which are very interconnected, and they all sort of provide feedback loops to each other. So, and given there is a significant overlap, therefore, between these three areas, it makes sense to try and address these three areas in a coherent approach. And that's where debt for climate and debt for climate and nature swaps come in. Next slide, please. So innovative financing instruments like debt for nature and climate swaps can leverage existing debt stocks, can address debt, climate, and nature issues at the same time. They emerged in the late 1980s as a way to address both the debt crisis of the time and the growing environmental issues as the factors of production increased and as there was growing awareness of the impact on nature. So the environmentalist Thomas Lovejoy, who was then the deputy vice president of the World Wildlife Fund, developed the concept as a way to address the Latin American debt crisis and meet the need for increased environmental funding. The idea was that an NGO acted as a donor. They purchased debt from commercial banks at well below the face value on the secondary market. And then that resulted in a certain amount of relief on the debt value, on the debt's value for the debtor government. So the first debt for nature swap was signed between Conservation International and Bolivia in 1987. And then the US government became increasingly involved in debt swaps in the early 2000s, following the enactment of the 1998 Tropical Forest Conservation Act, TCFA. One of the Act's key objectives was to provide developing countries with debt relief in exchange for increased local conservation of tropical forests. And I think there's around 14 transactions that took place under that act. And so you'll see the majority of this graph on the left-hand side, that's sort of the earlier debt swaps of this time, and those were very much debt for nature swaps. Then the need for these kind of swaps, they were really born out of this debt crisis. And the need for them dampened in the late 1990s as the HIPC initiative came into place. That was a really big, comprehensive initiative that was addressing the debt issues of the time, and so sort of took over that place. And so then we come to the recent debt crisis, and we see again this sort of similar pattern of needing to address the debt crisis as well as addressing climate and nature financing. And so you're seeing the emergence now of these transactions, or the re-emergence of these transactions, I should say. And so on the right-hand side, you see debt for climate and nature swaps, and you see that they're increasing in volume. So the transactions are becoming bigger and more scaled up. Next slide, please. So just to take a bit of a step back then, looking at the history and what's been emerging, debt for nature and climate swaps are an approach that seeks to coherently tackle these three areas. And debt swaps is a broad umbrella term that captures a range of financing structures and arrangements. So fundamentally, swaps are transactions where the debt is reduced and investment in climate and nature is increased. And this might be through a creditor and a debtor agreeing to convert the debt in some way, for example, a change in the terms. So, for example, increasing the payback period, decreasing the interest rate, or some other type of term that lowers the cost of the loan and frees up some financing. And something like that could also be achieved through the provision of guarantees from a third party that can help provide some de-risking. So there's a number of ways that the terms can be changed. Buying back debt at a cheaper rate on the secondary market, and that's where an actor buys back the debt. And this could be the debtor country themselves, or it could be a third party doing it on their behalf. Or it could be supporting the conversion of the debt into a different financial vehicle. And these transactions may include some degree of debt relief through a reduction on the principal. And then also to note that these operations are not mutually exclusive. So it could be a combination of debt relief, a change in the terms, a change in the vehicle. Yeah, it really depends on the context and the objective of the swap. And then the money that's freed up or saved from this transaction is then used to invest in climate and nature. So in effect, what we have is the money that was going from a government budget to service a loan would now be going from the government budget to pay for climate and nature activities in that country. So this is likely to be more effective than the debtor country paying debt service to creditors and then, say, separately receiving climate finance from a creditor for a specific climate intervention, because it means that the finance doesn't need to leave and re-enter the country. So it's staying within the government, and then it also means that it can be channeled through the government budget systems. It means that the structure of the debt payment, service payment sets up a regular stream of flows for climate action. And all of these things contribute to improving a country's capacity and capabilities for addressing climate and nature as well. Yeah, next slide, please. So sorry for the small diagrams here. Again, these diagrams have been taken from the Green Climate Fund paper. And I didn't want to talk through them in too much detail. I think it's laid out very well in the paper. I just wanted to elaborate on this point as well, that there are different swap structures, and it really depends on the actors involved in the type of transactions taking place. And just to talk a bit through these, so the one on the top left, for example, is a bilateral debt swap structure. So this is a two-party swap. So you have a debtor government and a creditor, and they bilaterally discuss and they reach an agreement. And the agreement may be some debt reduction or debt restructuring, and that's in exchange for some climate or nature outcome that will be supported by the debtor country. So, for example, a couple of years back, Cabo Verde negotiated a bilateral debt swap with Portugal, who is their biggest creditor. Then you have multi-party swaps. So the diagram on the right shows, on the top right, shows the situation where a third party buys the debtor country's debt at a discounted price on the secondary market. Subsequently, that debt is structured, and in exchange, there's some financing freed up for the debtor country that they use to finance nature and climate outcomes. On the bottom left is the situation where a debtor country is supported by a donor institution to buy back their own debt and then reissue it for better terms. And this is an approach to addressing commercial debt holdings generally, where it's harder to negotiate directly, and a buyback approach is quite useful. And then the diagram on the bottom right shows the case of then a donor institution providing credit enhancements and guarantees to attract financing from commercial investors into the transaction too. So as you see, there's a lot of potential in these transactions to increase the number of creditors being engaged, to bring in more donor institutions to play roles like bringing in additional funding or de-risking the transaction to to attract other investors to bring in funding. And yeah, you can make these transactions more complex, more multi-part. And I think it's also then about striking a balance between the complexity, which will add to the time and the costs of this transaction, with the objectives of the transaction and the country context and what's possible. Next slide, please. Thanks. So we looked into the potential volume of swaps, and this was drawing from the experience in the delivery of the HIPC initiative, and also the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, MIDRI, and the Brady Plan for Commercial Debt, which all took place around the same period during the late 90s, early 2000s. And we used those experiences to estimate how much potential debt swaps had and how much new debt issuances could have. And we found that debt swaps could mobilize upwards of 105 billion US dollars, and more than 329 billion US dollars could be unlocked from new debt issuances. Also, just another note on the calculation is that this isn't the full value of the debt stocks treated or the full value of the transactions. These are numbers given just on how much of the transaction could go to nature and climate outcomes. And I used the previous initiatives to estimate around 26% of a transaction going to of the freed up net present value of the transactions going to these kind of outcomes, based on how much went to poverty reduction from the HIPC, the MIDRI initiatives. Yeah, next slide, please. So there are a number of issues and challenges with executing debt swaps. So I've listed a few here. The first is a lack of political will across actors around addressing debt issues, or of being sort of first movers on these types of transactions, because it's still quite a nascent instrument. And I think until a track record is built up, many organizations, many donors are reluctant to sort of be the first mover on these kind of things. And yeah, just general political commitment to formalizing some of these transactions, let's say, in the international architecture. Another key challenge is that any operation that affects the terms of debt repayment counts as a technical default. So that can negatively impact a country's credit rating. This is a huge disincentive for developing countries. And recently we saw, or there's been some articles about Colombia who were saying they are being put off doing a debt swap because of the impact on their credit rating. And there are various initiatives going on at the moment that are looking into how to reform credit ratings, the way credit ratings are determined, that do not sort of almost punish proactive debt management. But that's still a key concern. Then, as I discussed earlier, the structure of swaps can get very complicated very quickly, and it is a very time-consuming, a very long process, includes a lot of actors. And then finally, there's been a lot of criticisms about the approach in relation to country ownership and local level ownership. So many swaps have involved establishing parallel mechanisms operating outside of government structures. This limits national oversight and transparency. Funds have been distributed through international non-governmental organizations, which have limited democratic oversight and accountability. There's also been controversial sort of approaches in terms of failing to meet local priorities and even undermining local rights. So, for example, the Inter-American Development Bank is recently opened up an inquiry under the Galapagos swap following complaints from local communities. Next slide, please. So a lot of these critiques are quite similar to the ones that have been historically leveled at aid projects. So conditionality, policy misalignment, off-budget financial management, areas like this. And the principles of effective development cooperation were developed through an OECD process over the last few decades were designed to address these kind of issues with development finance. So IIED recently did some analysis of how this approach to debt swaps, or how approaches to debt swaps, I should say, could learn from the principles of effective development finance. And these are some of the areas that we found would show as good practice. So swaps should seek to engage all creditors on an equal footing and take a comprehensive approach to the country's creditors. And a good way to facilitate this is having a formal platform, having some standardization, some international principles, and a body that can regulate at the international level. There's a need for there to be a shift to systemic programs. The funds from a swap transaction should be general purpose, inclusive, and integrated into development objectives. The funds should go through the government budget and systems as much as possible, and the fund should be managed as performance-based payments based on key performance indicators drawn from countries' climate, nature, and development commitments. So all of this isn't happening yet, but we are seeing good practice emerging from recent transactions heading towards this. And then just on my final slide, I will talk very briefly through the role of different actors. So we have the debtor countries, and I think they play a key role in taking leadership of showing their political commitment to undertaking these transactions, being proactive about debt management, about climate and nature financing, and ensuring there are equitable and comprehensive processes at the national level for preparing for a swap, because it takes a lot of preparation, a lot of effort before you reach the negotiating stage of one of these transactions. So it's about engaging with local and non-governmental as well as governmental actors in country. On the creditors side, I've spoken a bit about it, so I won't go too much into the different types of actors, but you have different public, multilateral, private actors, and they all have different incentives, different contexts and relationships with a country. And then you also have actors like bilateral and multilateral institutions that provide public financing but may not be creditors to that country. And I think they still play a key role in providing additional finance into a transaction like this, and also providing support through credit enhancements and guarantees. So we've seen the US International Development Finance Corporation and the Inter-American Development Bank play this kind of role in a number of transactions. You also have philanthropies that can crowd in financing and help get some of the initiatives on the environment and climate side off the ground. And we saw that play a big role, for example, in the Seychelles transaction in 2015. Then we have the role of civil society and their voice in and across the development of these kind of transactions. And then we have private sector organizations that, as well as playing a role in investing, can play a role in the delivery of some of the climate and nature outcomes, supporting with modeling, supporting with the planning stages, supporting with monetizing aspects, and on the measurement side, for example, supporting with monitoring and reporting through remote sensing approaches, things like this. So I'm going to leave it there, and yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sejal. I think for the interest of time, maybe we'll move to the next presentation. But I had a question to you and to Alexandre. So we see that most of these transactions have been mainly led by the US government as creditor. And of course, for these transactions to happen, the debt has to be renegotiated between the debtor and the creditor. And we need political willingness on both sides, which is not a constant because governments change. So do you think we'll see, you mentioned one of the transactions that was not led by the US between Portugal and Cabo Verde. Do you think we'll see more transactions happening involving other creditors, maybe EU, Japan, or supranational entities? Can you mute you?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's a good question, and I do think so. I think the momentum is building for these transactions. We've seen them increase in scale, and I think we're seeing them increase in the number of transactions as well more recently. And we're learning from some of the experiences of these swaps. I think there is a space for institutions, donors to step up from Europe, Japan, Australia, other places, as well as so, for example, we recently saw the Green Climate Fund supporting a debt for climate swap. I think it was in Barbados, but it was in December of last year. We've also seen the World Bank is supporting debt for climate and debt for development swap. So they've recently supported Côte d'Ivoire with a debt for development swap. IMF has released working papers where they're also thinking through their role. So I do think there's a lot of potential, and there's a lot of thinking going on across different actors of how to get involved and learning from some of the recent practices.
Alexandre, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks, Amal. Yeah, I totally agree with you, Sejal. It's time for the other countries to step up as well. We are being involved in some negotiations going forward from especially European countries and Japan as well, potential transactions that can occur in the near future. So given the current political situation in the US, regardless of this political situation, we can see other countries stepping up for this transaction as well.
Great. So let's move on to your presentation. I had a comment on presentation not being very clear, so trying to fix that.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Alexandre Portnoi. I act as a senior legal advisor for Conservation International. I'm thrilled to be here today to share more about this exciting initiative. Thank you all for being here. I don't know, Amal, I can't see the presentation, so. Okay. All right, can go to the next slide. So first, I'd like to give you a brief overview of the transaction. It can be considered a bilateral debt swap, but with participation of NGOs. This is the first TFCCA transaction focused solely on coral reef ecosystems. It redirects approximately $35 million in Indonesia debt originally owed to the US government toward coral reef conservation. More specifically, the US government forgives the debt, and in return, Indonesia must contribute around $35 million into a conservation trust fund over time. The funds will be used to support conservation efforts in two priority marine areas: the Bird's Head Seascape and the Sundarbans Seascape, both globally significant ecosystems. So the parties involved in this transaction are the US government as the creditor, the government of Indonesia, the debtor, and two international NGOs, Conservation International, and the Nature Conservancy, and also Conservasi Indonesia and YCAN, the local partners of CI and TNC, supporting mainly the implementation of the transaction. I'll give you a brief context of the TFCCA program in my next slide, so you can go to the next one, Amal. Okay, so the TFCCA was enacted by the US Congress in 1998 as the Tropical Forest Conservation Act and expanded in 2019 to include coral reefs, reflecting growing urgency to protect those ecosystems. Debt for nature swaps allow countries to redirect debt payments into conservation efforts instead of repaying their creditors, in this case, the US. And so far, globally, 23 TFCCA deals have been completed, generating over $400 million for tropical forest and coral reef conservation. You can go to the next one. There are three core agreements into this transaction. The first one is the debt swap agreement, in which the US government forgives the debt and the government of Indonesia commits to make payments into the conservation fund. There is also a swap fee agreement in which CI and TNC contribute financially by contributing $4.5 million to the US government to help facilitate this transaction. And of course, the core of this transaction is the Coral Reef Conservation Agreement that defines how the funds will be used, sets the governance mechanisms, and lays out monitoring, reporting, and auditing requirements. You can go to the next one. So the governance and success of this initiative depends on several important players here. The first one is the Oversight Committee that sets funding priorities, approves grants, and oversees implementation. The fund administrator, in this case, Kehati, that is a local NGO in Indonesia that manages the proposals and generally supports the Oversight Committee. A trustee, in this case, Vistra, that holds the funds in trust and ensures compliant disbursement. The investment manager that invests the funds to ensure long-term impact, and of course, the grant recipients that implement the conservation work on the ground. You can go to the next one. Talk a little bit more about the governance structure. We do have an oversight committee with 9 members, 2 each from the government of Indonesia, 2 from the US government, and 2 from KI, and 1 from YCAN. And also 2 local NGOs nominated by the permanent members. These groups defines priorities, makes grant decisions, supervise the fund's performance, and ensures accountability through robust monitoring and evaluation. You can go to the next one. Okay, so supporting the committee are also other players that are very, very important for this transaction. The first one is the fund administrator, as I said, Kehati, that supports the proposal evaluation and the monitoring, a trustee that holds and opened a trust account in Singapore to securely manage the funds, and also the investment manager that follows the oversight committee guidelines to invest the funds, the proceeds of the fund, and to help to generate more proceeds. Can you go to the next one? Talking about the grant recipients here, eligible grant recipients include Indonesian NGOs, community-based organizations, including indigenous and coral reef dependent groups, and in limited cases, government entities involved in enhancing coral reef governance. And it's important to highlight that the participation of subnational entities of the government of Indonesia must occur without replacing their existing funding commitments. You can go to the next one. Okay, so talking a little bit more about the flow of funds at closing. So at or prior to closing, several key actions occurred. So the legal agreements, of course, were signed in July last year, establishing the oversight committee and the fund governance structure. The administrator was appointed by the members of the oversight committee. Of course, the parties nominated the members of the oversight committee. PI and TNC contributed $4.5 million to the US government, who forgave and restructured the Indonesian debt. And also a trust account was established in Singapore to hold the conservation fund. And it's important to say here, and this transaction actually closed in January this year, so before the change of the administration in the US. So it's important to say that this transaction is not related to the Indonesia coral bonds issued in 2024. That is also contributing to the conservation of coral reefs in Indonesia. You can go to the next one, Amal. So following the closing of the transaction, phase begins. This is where the conservation funding mechanisms goes into action. So first, the government of Indonesia begins making scheduled payments into the trust fund account, in this case, called the debt service account. These payments are deposited in this account in Singapore, opened by the trustee. And from there, the oversight committee takes the lead in approving an annual budget, which outlines the planned funding allocations for the conservation activities for the year ahead. Once the budget is approved, the fund administrator, acting, of course, on instructions from the Oversight Committee, directs a trustee to release the funds from the debt service account to the local grants account, open in the name of the fund administrator. These accounts allows for local disbursements to grantees operating in the regions. At the same time, the Oversight Committee, supported by the fund administrator, review the project proposals and ensuring alignment with the conservation priorities. And during all this process, the investment manager is responsible for investing any unused funds in line with the Oversight Committee guidance, ensuring fund growth and remains sustainable over time. You can go to the next one. Okay, so funds can be used for activities that support coral reef and coastal ecosystem protection, such as creating and maintaining marine protected areas, sustainable reef and ecosystem management, capacity building through local training, research and biodiversity support, and also enhancing sustainable livelihoods and protecting endangered species. You can go to the next one. So here you can see a map of the two geographic priorities. We are considering the Banda seascape and the Lesser Sunda seascape as one seascape. So you can see the size of those seascapes. So you can go to the next one. So just talking about the numbers here, those areas have more than 163 million hectares, of which more than 6 million hectares of coral reef, more than 550,000 hectares of mangrove, and more than 245,000 of seagrass. You can go to the next one. So why focus on birds' heads and Sunda Banda seascapes? These areas are amongst the most biodiverse marine regions on Earth. So they contain more than 600 species of hard coral that accounts for more than 75% of the global total, more than 1,800 species of reef fish. These are also regions where CI, TNC, and the local NGOs have deep knowledge and long-term presence. Their expertise and close relationship with local communities made us essential, helping both governments identify geographic priorities that align, of course, with the Indonesian National Conservation Strategy. So in our view, this is a fundamental piece of this transaction, ensuring that the priorities and the geographies that we are invested in are aligned with the Indonesian National Conservation Strategies. So finally, I'd like to share a few personal reflections and images from our 2024 visit to region part of the Bird's Head Seascape. During that trip, that was during our negotiations with the government of Indonesia, we were able to visit several conservation sites where Conservation International is already doing impactful work. So CI established an auditors fund in the region called the Blue Body Fund in 2017. With this new Debt for Nature swap, we envision strong collaboration between the Blue Body Fund and the TFCCA Fund to enhance protection efforts in the region and ensure long-term sustainability. So as Sejal said, countries burdened by debt often feel pressure to exploit natural resources unsustainably to meet their financial obligations. So Debt for Nature swaps offer a way out of that cycle. Instead of high interest repayments, the fund go into a long-term conservation, a strategy that supports both environmental health and economic sustainability. We are very glad, we are at CI, are very glad to broker the first Debt for Nature swap back in 1987. So since then, this model has unlocked critical funding and of course evolved to many other types of transactions. And we are very excited about the future of coral reef conservation in Indonesia. We've got strong local connections, a reliable network, and two great financing options ready to go. So thank you again for for your attention. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Amal and NTC, for organizing this very important webinar.